All right, in this video, we're going to talk about Chapter 6, Section D of Baronett. Now, look, you have learned so far in this chapter 2 ways of identifying whether or not a syllogism is valid or invalid. One way that you could do is simply to memorize all of the valid forms of categorical syllogism. You could memorize the mood and form, and that way when you saw any argument with that form, you'd know that's one of the valid ones. You could do that. I think there's 15. There's a list of them in your book. Or you could do the method that we learned last time. You could make a Venn diagram and use the Venn diagram to determine whether or not the argument is valid. And now we're going to learn a third way. The third way is that you can test any syllogism, any categorical syllogism, to see if it follows the rules. Now, we're going to learn 6 rules that all valid categorical syllogisms have to obey. If a syllogism follows all the rules, then it's valid. If it breaks one or more of the rules, it is not valid. Now, you need to know all these rules by heart, and you need to be able to apply them to a categorical syllogism and use them to determine whether or not the syllogism is valid. So we'll walk through these rules now. Now, I'm going to walk through the rules fairly briefly. Here's what's difficult about the rules. The rules are going to require you to remember some terminology and ideas that we picked up in previous chapters. In particular, as you'll see, you'll need to know what the major term is, what the minor term is, and what the middle term is. And you also have to know the concept of distribution. Distribution. That's back from chapter 5. And you may be right now panicking and thinking, I don't remember what distribution is. Well, I often don't remember either, and I have to remind myself. So let me remind you now. You can remember distribution using the acronym SUPN, S-U-P-N. My slide says that this is back on page 200, but that actually refers to page 200 of the last edition of the book. So it's somewhere like in chapter 5. So SUPN stands for subjects, universals, predicates, negatives. And the idea is subjects, that is the subject term of a proposition, subjects are distributed by universals. So if you have a universal categorical proposition that says all S are P or no S are P, the S is distributed in either one of those. The second part of the SUPN acronym stands for this. Predicates are distributed by negatives. Okay, so think about your negative categorical propositions. Those are the E-type propositions, which say no S is P. Well, the predicate, the P in that E-type proposition is distributed. The other negative is O. Some S are not P. Well, the predicate, the P, is distributed in the O-type proposition. So you can remember the acronym, or you can just memorize for the 4 forms of categorical proposition what gets distributed. So in an A-type proposition, the subject alone gets distributed, all S or P. In an E-type proposition, no S or P, the subject and the predicate are both distributed. In the I-type proposition, which says some S are P, neither the subject nor the predicate get distributed. And in the O-type proposition, which says some S are not P, only the predicate gets distributed. All right, all that is just terminological review so that you can understand the rules. Rule number 1 says this: the middle term must be distributed in at least one premise. Remember, the middle term is the term that appears in both the major and the minor premise, but not in the conclusion. Rule number 2, if a term is distributed in the conclusion, then it must be distributed in a premise. Rule number 3, a categorical syllogism cannot have 2 negative premises. Doesn't work. Rule number 4, a negative premise has to have a negative conclusion. And rule number 5 is the flip side of that. A negative conclusion must have a negative premise. And rule number 6, 2 universal premises cannot have a particular conclusion. Now, you're going to have to sit down and study those, look at a few examples, memorize them, and then you'll be in a position to apply them in your homework. I'm going to skip ahead and do some application now, do a couple examples. So here's the kind of problem that you might be faced with. Use the 6 rules to determine whether this syllogism is valid. I3. Now, I know some logic students are so clever that they can just look at the mood and form and figure it out. But for myself, who I'm a little bit slower, I have to first of all write out, wait, what is an IAI3 syllogism? And then I have to look and test it using the rules. Okay, so I'm going to spell out the answers here. So the I-type proposition says some SRP. So it's going to be that I form. An A is a all SRP type thing, and an I is again, some SRP. Now, that tells us the sum, the all, and the sum. But to figure out where the M and the P and the S are, you have to look at the figure. And this is a figure 3, which means the middle term gets put in the subject in both premises. So that's why we knew how to put the M in those slots. And then, well, we know that the major premise is going to be the premise that contains the major term, which is the predicate of the conclusion. So how do we know that there's going to be a P in this first premise? Well, because in the conclusion, there's the predicate is the P, so that's going to go in the major premise. And then the same with the S. How do we know there's going to be an S here in the slot where the middle term wasn't? Well, because that's the subject of the conclusion. That's where the minor term goes. So that's how that. Right now, we're just laying out what this syllogism is. Now let's use the rules to test it. So the first rule says the middle term has to be distributed in at least one premise. So we got to ask ourselves, is the M distributed here in premise 1? No, because in an I-type proposition, neither term is distributed. Is the M distributed here in the minor premise, all M are S? Yes, because remember, subject terms are distributed by universals. This is a universal statement. The subject, which is the M in this one, is distributed. So rule 1 checks out. Well, that pulled them all up for me. Okay, rule number 2, no term is not distributed in the conclusion. Or rather, here's the way we said it originally. If a term is distributed in the conclusion, then it must be distributed in a premise, right? So is anything distributed in the conclusion? Actually, no. So we don't have to worry about this because it's an I-type proposition and I's don't distribute anything. Rule number 3, a categorical syllogism cannot have 2 negative premises. Are there 2 negative premises? No, there's no negative premises. So that one checks out. Rule number 4, if there's a negative premise, it has got to have a negative conclusion, and vice versa for rule 5. Well, we don't have to worry about either one of those because there's no negative premise and no negative conclusion. And then rule 6, 2 universal premises cannot have a particular conclusion. We don't have to worry about that because we've just got one universal premise and the other premise is particular. So this doesn't break any of the rules, therefore it's valid. That's how that goes. It's kind of tedious and mechanical, but if you know the rules, you know what these terminology means, it's straightforward. Example 2, use rules and a Venn diagram to determine the validity of this one. So let's check with the rules first. Oh, it's boring. I'm just going to skip and tell you the answers. So it violates rule number 1. The middle term has to be distributed in at least one premise. What is the middle term? Well, first of all, what is the middle term? That's right, it's the G. Okay, is it distributed by the major premise, some G are not H? No, because in an O-type proposition, only the predicate's distributed, not the subject. So G doesn't get distributed. How about in all E or G? Well, no, G is not distributed here either, because in an A-type proposition, only the subject is distributed. So it broke rule number 1. The middle term is not distributed in at least one premise. No dice. Let's check it with the Venn diagram here. So if you diagram some G are not H, the X is going to go here in this area of G, which is totally outside of the H circle, but on the line. Okay, so far so good. Premise 2, all E are G, so we're going to shade out the 2 areas of E that don't overlap with G. Now, does our diagram require that some E are not H? Well, let's look at the E areas that are not H. We've got this one. Well, there's no E's here that aren't H because it's shaded out. What about here? Is there anything here in this area of E that's not H? We don't know because that X is on the line. There might not be any X's in this area right here. They might all be over here. So the diagram tells us that conclusion doesn't necessarily follow. Let's do one more for kicks. Some furry creatures are lovable pets. Some eccentric people are lovable pets. So some eccentric people are furry creatures. I feel like this syllogism has new resonance in our day and age, but I will leave that for another class. Okay, so first of all, let's diagram this. Let F equal furry creatures, L be lovable pets, E will be eccentric people. Here's the syllogism you've got. Some F are L. Some E are L, therefore some E are F. Let's use our rules. Is the middle term, this is rule number 1, is the middle term distributed in at least one premise? Nope, because you got 2 I premises, and I premises don't distribute anything. You broke rule number 1. Are any other rules broken? Let's see. No, I don't see any other rules broken, but it broke rule number 1. And what about the Venn diagram? Here's what it looks like. If you diagram the 2 premises, you got X's on these 2 lines. Does that require that some E are F? Now, if some E are F, then you've got to have an X either in this area 1 here in the middle, directly in it, or in this area right here. But we don't have an X in either one of those or on the line between them. We've got X's on these 2 out border lines, which means they might not be in area 1. So the premises don't necessitate the conclusion. It is not valid. Don't pass go. Don't pass $200. Don't collect $200. That's from a board game named Monopoly, which I don't know if you've played before or not, but I say it often. All right, folks, so memorize your rules, memorize your distribution terms, and you'll be able to use those to determine the validity of categorical syllogisms. Enjoy that.